Hi, I'm Stefan Kertes with On Becoming a Healer, and today we're going to be speaking with a special guest about a story written by James Baldwin and published in 1956 called Sonny's Blues. It's a story about a relationship in which two brothers are suffering. One has an addiction, and the other has troubles relating to him. But in some ways, it is the one without the addiction who seems to be the one who needs the most help. Just a quick note for listeners, we'll be using the vernacular of the time, including addict, junkie, etc. Obviously, in professional context, these are not the words that we'd use presently, but it fits with the discussion you're about to listen to. And with us today, we have my co-host, Saul. Hi, Saul.
Hi, Stefan.
And we have Professor Laura Greene from Augustana College in Illinois. Hi, Laura.
Hi, Stefan.
Laura is a professor of English at Augustana College, as I mentioned, and she is an expert in this story, and she's going to help us delve into its meanings. But before we do that, I'd like to ask Saul to sort of get us started here.
Thanks, Stefan. So, as some listeners may recall, in January, we ran an episode with the title About Me Being Racist, a conversation that follows an apology. And in that title, the me is referring to actually me, Saul. The purpose of that episode was for me to share with listeners an experience in which I had hurt somebody, a colleague, many years ago because of racist ideas that I had internalized and that led to actions on my part. And then last month in February, we followed that up with a second episode in which we explored, again, through me, where some of those racist ideas came from. I thought of myself as growing up in a fairly liberal and progressive family and environment. And yet, reflecting back, I can see that a lot of the messages that I internalized probably contributed to some of the racist behavior that is described in that episode. And since then, I've been really reflecting a lot on how to change. And one of the writers who's had a huge impact on me is James Baldwin. And so today's episode is both a link to the prior two episodes, but also a break from it. As we are moving into another era, we're going to be talking today about, as you mentioned, a story about addiction and suffering. And I think that what has been so powerful for me about James Baldwin is I found him to be a sort of truth teller. You know, on the one hand, he writes about anti-Black racism, and at another level, he's just transformative. This is a writer who thinks about the human condition, and he's not just interested, for instance, on how people who are Black are adversely affected by racism, but he's interested in the way people who exploit others and who are racist are also diminished, and in some ways more damaged than those who are affected by them. And so a few months ago, Laura reached out to me. She had read my book on becoming a healer, and I think may have listened to an episode or two of this podcast. And we got to talking, and it turned out we both love James Baldwin. And one of the stories that she mentioned is this story, Sonny's Blues, because it does relate to addiction. And Stefan, you're an addiction medicine physician, among other things. And of course, many of our listeners are physicians who care for patients. And we live in a world now where many of our patients are struggling with addiction. And one of the things about this story is it goes far beyond, obviously, just talking about addiction. And as I think you'll come to appreciate, it's really takes a transformative look at some of the themes of being human and how addiction fits into that. For listeners who've not had an opportunity to read Sonny's Blues, and you can actually access a free copy of it from the wiki page about Sonny's Blues, if you're so inclined. In brief, this is the story of two brothers who grew up in Harlem. There's the older brother who's the narrator and the younger brother who's named Sonny. We never find out what the older brother's name is. And Sonny is arrested for using heroin, and I think also for selling it. At the very beginning of the story, we find that out through the narrator who is telling the story in the first person. He basically reads about it in a news story. The narrator is an algebra teacher, and he's pretty straight-laced. He's kind of followed the path to, quote, success, and is frustrated with his brother, who seems to have gone off the path, and just wants Sonny to get a real education and a job. And what we learn is that Sonny's an artist, he's a musician, and is seeking a different path to success, one that seems more fraught, more creative, and his brother doesn't get it. And so this is a story of that relationship, and it's a story, as you'll learn, about suffering, about addiction, which is why we thought it might be related to the themes of this podcast, And as we go along, we'll be filling you in on some of the details. So if you haven't read Sonny's Blues, you'll be fine. I think that for those of us who do take care of patients, this is a much needed widening of our lens. And that's why I think it's so valuable, at least for me, to look at a piece of literature like this. We fall back on words like opioid use disorder and evidence-based treatments like buprenorphine and so forth. And of course, those are all important, but we end up with this very narrow lens. And today's conversation, I hope, will be in some way an antidote to that. Before I turn it over, I just wanted to share a quote from Maya Salovitz, who is an opinion writer for the New York Times, who is herself a recovering addict and writes extensively about addiction. And Stefan, I know you know her. And she wrote recently, actually very recently in the New York Times about this topic. And she concluded by saying, quote, "A life worth living in which you feel deeply connected to others, have the tools you need to manage distress, and have a strong sense of purpose is the best defense against addiction." So, for those of you who are healthcare professionals, Sonny's Blues is a reminder of the rich complexity of someone who is dealing with a suffering and addiction. But it's also, I think, an opportunity to reflect on what happens to us as healthcare professionals when we respond to people who are suffering, in this case to our patients, in a way that may not be healing for them and actually not healing for us either. And that's what's explored in, I think, such a nuanced way by James Baldwin. Thanks, Stefan.
Thanks, all. So, Laura, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Is it true? Did you actually hear a previous episode?
Oh, I've heard them all.
Oh, wow. Okay. I'm tickled pink. I could dedicate the next hour to what you liked best about our prior episodes, but I guess I should ask, more importantly, to today's subject. Can you share with us, from your perspective as an English professor, an English literature lover, what drew you to this story by James Baldwin?
Well, it seems to me one of the most profound stories about human suffering that I've ever read, right up there with King Lear, I think, honestly, in trying to take on that complicated, enormously important subject. So not only does it sort of look at suffering and the problem of suffering, but it looks at different ways that people use to cope with suffering, one of which is addiction, but that's not the only way. And it seems to me to be a relationship about, one brother who's an addict, another brother who isn't, and the brother who isn't is in some ways trying to care for the addict, Sonny, but at least initially he cares for him badly. He abandons him, he judges him, he disapproves of him. And the more I thought about the narrator, the more I saw some parallels to some of the dysfunctional behaviors that Saul talks about in his book. So this narrator he's overwhelmed, he's sort of disenchanted with his life, he's deeply wounded himself. And that reminded me in some ways of a kind of burned out doctor. But what's particularly interesting for me is he's somebody who is trying hard to grow. And it turns out that he needs his brother's help to do that. And he comes to realize that. So it seemed to me that for a podcast like this about trying to learn how to become a healer, that is the quest of this story, I think.
Right. And I'll do a tiny bit of scene setting. Saul did some as well. The narrator is 7 years older than his brother. They both grew up in Harlem. This is probably in the 1950s, early 50s. The narrator is an algebra teacher. He's hearing about his brother who has been away for a while, and it's the younger brother, Sonny, with the addiction. And somewhere in that process, we know the younger brother has a problem, but gradually begin to feel the older one does too. And with that, maybe the next question here is, I mean, the story introduces the idea that somebody has an addiction, but it doesn't do it at the start. It's not like the first line of the story is, my brother has an addiction and I'm troubled by it. How does Baldwin set this up? How do we learn who these people are, and how does it become clear there is a problem?
Well, the story starts actually in a confusing way. There's a reference to it. I couldn't believe it, he says, and the it is not explained for 2 or 3 paragraphs, which partly suggests how much trouble the narrator has dealing with the fact that his brother, what's happened is that his brother has been arrested for using and peddling heroin. And he finds this out in the newspaper, in the subway when he's reading it, and he's shocked by this realization and has to confront it and deal with it. But instead of reaching out to him right away and writing to him and finding out how he is, he just ignores him. He doesn't do anything. In fact, he does nothing until his baby daughter dies. And then once his baby daughter dies, that pain is so overwhelming to him that he reaches out to Sonny. He says, "My trouble made his real." In other words, the narrator's suffering made Sonny's suffering real. And that's when he reaches out to him. And then most of the rest of the story is about when Sonny comes out of prison and how the two interact after that.
And to get to that point, though, as I recall, the story flips back in time to when the narrator, who's, as I said, 7 years older, has gotten married, and his younger brother is in high school, but not always showing up to class. And there's a real dispute between them. The narrator's back from the military and on his way to becoming an upstanding member of society. His younger brother looks like trouble, and I wonder if you can talk about how he sees his younger brother as a high schooler.
Well, his problem with his brother as a high schooler, I mean, first of all, he's not going to school. And second of all, he's wants to become a musician, a serious musician, a jazz musician. But the narrator has come to sort of think of musicians as kind of low class, what his father called good time people. And so the narrator, again, he wants Sonny to be safe. He wants him to have a good job. He's got to go back to the military and overseas. And he sort of wants to know that Sonny is settled and safe. So he tries to sort of get him to be more conventional, go to school. Okay, if you want to do your music, but what you really need to do is focus on being a more upright, conventional citizen.
Yeah, that word safety plays a big role in
Yeah.
this story. An upright person might be somebody who achieves safety, and other people don't. That's a big concept here. There's actually a quote where it's in a different part of the story, but the narrator's watching his brother for signs of dope
Yeah.
addiction, and he says, "I was trying to remember everything I'd heard about dope addiction, and I couldn't help watching Sonny for signs. I wasn't doing it out of malice. I was trying to find out something about my brother. I was dying to hear him tell me he was safe." Then it's a sudden scene shift. "Safe," my father grunted, whenever Mama suggested trying to move to a neighborhood which might be safer for children. "Safe? Hell. Ain't no place safe for kids nor nobody," says the father. And it sounds like this safety venture is really the obsession of the older brother, something rejected by their father who's long since gone, and the fear he has on behalf of Sonny himself.
Yes. And I mean, I think that that desire for safety, not only for safety, but for the certainty of safety, that
Hmm.
he wants a sort of guarantee that his brother will be safe now and forever. And of course, he's not going to get that guarantee. No, none of us get that guarantee. But that does strongly motivate his behavior. And it turns out to be what gets in his way rather than what helps Sonny.
Does this story by Baldwin tell us why Sonny developed addiction, or why he developed addiction? Almost the wrong question.
It's not necessarily the wrong question. I mean, I think it's just that it's not only about addiction. I mean, as I sort of said before, it's a story about human suffering. And certainly as boys growing up in Harlem, both the narrator and Sonny saw a lot of suffering. The narrator talks about how rageful they were, bumping their heads against the low ceiling of possibilities that the white world gave to them. And the narrator himself actually has sort of twisted himself into kind of pretzel, trying to be the sort of good, respectable Black man who adopts all of the white man's values and characteristics. And that's its own kind of injury. I think the story is mostly about how people find different ways to cope with that suffering.
There is a kind of indictment of Harlem in the 1940s and
Oh, yes.
50s that is written into this story. And I was wondering if you could read a quote, because it may sound a little abstract. I was texting with Saul before this episode that there is a famous economist who is Black who speaks of Harlem as being quite a nice place in the late 40s and early 50s. But that's not James Baldwin's Harlem. And there are a couple quotes that really stand out about that. The killing streets of our childhood. Is there anyone you could share with us?
Yeah. That the killing streets of their childhood. I'll start with a few sentences before that. But this is This description takes place when Sonny has just gotten out of jail, and he and his brother are in a cab riding up Central Park into Harlem and looking out at what they see. And this is what he writes. This is the narrator speaking. So we drove along between the green of the park and the stony, lifeless elegance of hotels and apartment buildings toward the vivid, killing streets of our childhood. These streets hadn't changed, though the housing projects jutted up out of them now like rocks in the middle of a boiling sea. Most of the houses in which we had grown up had vanished, but houses exactly like the houses of our past yet dominated the landscape. Boys exactly like the boys we once had been found themselves smothering in these houses, came down into the streets for light and air, and found themselves encircled by disaster. Some escaped the trap, most didn't. Those who got out always left something of themselves behind, as some animals amputate a leg or leave it in the trap. It might be said, perhaps, that I'd escaped. After all, I was a schoolteacher. Or that Sonny had. He hadn't lived in Harlem for years. Yet as the cab moved uptown through the streets which seemed, with a rush, to darken with dark people, and as I covertly studied Sonny's face, it came to me that what we were both seeking through our separate cab windows was that part of ourselves which had been left behind. I think it's a kind of wonderful and awful description of what life was like for them in Harlem, this sense of trying to get out of the housing projects they're in or the homes they're in, coming out for air, but feeling once they get out, they are surrounded, encircled by disaster, he says. So first of all, there's just this omnipresent sense of menace from all sides. And then that way that he describes what happens as a result of that, that even if you escape the trap, you've been forced to gnaw off a limb, to self-amputate a limb to get out of there. So you've had to mutilate yourself, even to escape the terrible circumstances here.
And I think their suffering in Harlem is layered over with the experiences of their parents and their grandparents in this story. So they didn't just discover a difficult Harlem in the late 1940s and early 1950s. There's a history of suffering that trails back behind them that they are aware of at all times. There's another passage where there's a description. I mean, you could choose any one you like, but there are some passages that refer to their parents' history. I wonder if there's any you found particularly persuasive there.
Yeah, what the narrator describes here is a sort of regular Sunday afternoon after church where all the grown-ups have gathered around. They're sitting in the living room. They're looking out the window, watching the sun go down. And the children are sort of there, but the grown-ups have forgotten that they're there, and they're talking with each other. And so this is the passage in which the narrator describes that situation. He says, "For a moment, nobody's talking, but every face looks darkening like the sky outside. And my mother rocks a little from the waist, and my father's eyes are closed. Everyone is looking at something a child can't see. For a minute, they've forgotten the children. Maybe a kid is lying on the rug, half asleep. Maybe somebody's got a kid in his lap and is absentmindedly stroking the kid's head. Maybe there's a kid, quiet and big-eyed, curled up in a big chair in the corner. The silence, the darkness coming, and the darkness in the faces frightens the child obscurely. He hopes that the hand which strokes his forehead will never stop, will never die. He hopes that there will never come a time when the old folks won't be sitting around the living room, talking about where they've come from and what they've seen and what's happened to them and their kinfolk. But something deep and watchful in the child knows that this is bound to end, is already ending. In a moment, someone will get up and turn on the light. Then the old folks will remember the children, and they won't talk anymore that day. And when the light fills the room, the child is filled with darkness. He knows that every time this happens, he's moved just a little closer to that darkness outside. The darkness outside is what the old folks have been talking about. It's what they've come from. It's what they endure. The child knows that they won't talk anymore because if he knows too much about what's happened to them, he'll know too much, too soon, about what's going to happen to him.
I think that one story that haunted me is when the narrator and his mom talk before she dies, and she describes an incident that he was unaware of in which his father, many years ago, before they were born, had been out one night with his father's brother, in other words, the narrator's uncle, and something awful, really, really awful happens in which they're just having a fun time out at night. And a group of young white men in a car come and essentially run the boy over and kill him. And there's this horrid aftermath where the narrator's dad, who at the time is a teenager, is standing alone on a dark night on an empty road with his suddenly dead brother. And the narrator was unaware that this had ever happened until his mom shared the story with him. And this was after their dad had died. And it's so impactful because it gives you the sense of intergenerational trauma. I think you see that all of a sudden it becomes clear, I think to the narrator perhaps, that there was something about his dad that he'd never really understood. His dad always came across as very strong. And what his mom tells him is that his dad would frequently cry in her arms when the kids were not around, and that she basically held him together all the while that he was alive. And he hid this. He hid this and had a sort of tough exterior, but he was grieving and shattered at this experience of losing his brother who was murdered. And basically it completely changed the way he thought about white people and created a sort of bitterness in him. And I think just hearing that story puts in perspective what Laura just read, which is that behind all of this sort of quiet conversation is that sort of ominous backdrop that this murder is just an example of.
I agree, and I think it's also important to note that the folks talking around on Sunday afternoon get strength from each other in sharing and describing their own suffering. And that's partly why the child still wants them to keep talking. And it's interesting to me that the child is most distressed when they stop talking about what's
Uh,
really going to happen. And I think it's also interesting that I believe it's the mother who won't let father tell the boys about what happened to his brother, Sonny's uncle. And again, in an attempt to try to protect them from the terrible world that they are inheriting. But I don't think the story presents that as a great alternative. These boys need to know about that brother, and knowing about him would have given them more insight, I think, into their own father and the future that they have, and maybe given them a different perspective on how to deal with it.
Yeah, and I think in many ways, this is a story about, to use again a little bit of medical lingo, functional and dysfunctional ways of responding to suffering. And throughout the story, we see a number of ways in which people respond to suffering. And you said one of them is by trying to hide and shut down something terrible and not talk about it. Problem doesn't go away,
No.
and it ripples through the generations, regardless. And so that's certainly one way in which an attempt to deal with suffering doesn't work.
that passage, which describes the mother reporting the story of their uncle's death to the narrator when he's grown up, she does it with a purpose to say to the narrator, don't let go of your brother. And he says, I won't forget. Don't you worry. I won't forget. I won't let nothing happen to Sonny. And the mother smiles and she says, you may not be able to stop nothing from happening, but you got to let him know you's there. And the next line is, 2 days later, I was married, and then I was gone. I mean, like, it's a very powerful transition. And then I was gone, which is the exact opposite of what the mother wants. And it sort of sets up the problem between the narrator and his brother as he's on his way out and his brother's on his way to becoming a musician. I wondered, Laura, if you can introduce to us, why does this draw such disapproval from the narrator in this story? If somebody says to me, I want to be an artist, I might say, how are you going to make a living at that? That's a question, but it seems to draw up something even stronger than that from the older brother in this story. What's going on between these brothers?
Well, one thing that Sonny's music does, the kind of music that he's interested in, which is bebop jazz, that kind of jazz is much more powerfully associated with civil rights movement, with pushing back against assimilationism of being like white people. And the narrator several times refers to that kind of music as sounding disordered and weird. And it's pretty clear that the narrator is really stuck on this idea of, look, I'm going to keep myself safe and my family safe if I just play by the rules that the white people lay out for me. And he tries very hard to get Sonny to play by those rules. So when the narrator is talking with Sonny about what he's going to do and how he's going to become a musician, and he says, "Well, can you make a living at it?" And Sonny responds, "Well, yeah, sure, I can make a living at it. But what I don't seem to be able to make you understand is that it's the only thing I want to do." And then here comes the narrator trying to push Sonny down to the level of the low ceiling of his possibilities. He says, "Well, Sonny," I said gently, "people can't always exactly do what they want to do." And then here's Sonny's response. "No, I don't know that," said Sonny, surprising me. "I think people ought to do what they want to do. Else, what are they alive for?" So here is Sonny just pushing back very hard on his brother's kind of conventional behavior, his attempt to sort of keep him safe by doing something utterly conventional. And Sonny just is not having it.
Does Sonny suffer for Sonny's choice, in your view? I mean, this is a story about suffering. We say that up
Yeah.
front. What's the suffering in Sonny?
Well, it's the same suffering as his brother, as his parents. I mean, he's growing up in Harlem. He's living under the strictures of anti-Black racism. I mean, I don't think his suffering is that different. What is different is his response to it, which is that he wants to push back against it partly and demand that he should have a better life, that he should be able to do what he wants to do, because that's what makes you alive.
Well, they have a similar grounds for suffering at the beginning. It's their
Right,
families, it's Harlem, it's
right,
what's been before. Sonny's response
right.
somehow involves leaving jazz and heroin.
Yes.
The narrator's response is teaching algebra.
Yeah, yeah. Well, that's how they are so profoundly different. I mean, that the brother is trying very hard to live the life that white people tell him to live, and Sonny is simply not interested in that and won't give up. I think Sonny knows he has a gift, and that gift will not stay inside him, and he doesn't want it to. But it's also true that because he doesn't get to exercise that gift in the way that he wants to, at least early on, he turns to heroin as another way of sort of coping with suffering. And that, of course, is something that the narrator doesn't do and something that the white world certainly disapproves of.
Yeah, at a later time in the story, Sonny does say that heroin offers some positive feelings. It's after watching a gospel singer. And Sonny says, her voice reminded me for a minute of what heroin feels like sometimes when it's in your veins. It makes you feel sort of warm and cool at the same time, and distant and sure. He sipped his beer very deliberately, not looking at me. I watched his face. It makes you feel in control. Sometimes you've got to have that feeling, in control.
Yeah.
The brothers fail, or at least the narrator. I mean, this story ostensibly is about Sonny, who has the blues. Sonny has a problem, but you've pointed this out that in a lot of ways, it's the older brother, the narrator, whose name is never said, who seems to have the problem. He can't connect. Tell us more about the shortfall in the narrator.
Well, it's his way of coping that's quite different from Sonny's, which is partly to be assimilationist, but also to sort of deny and distance himself from suffering, to try to avoid it, to try to get away from it, imagine that it's not there. And that turns out to be a pretty lousy way of coping. And what it does is it makes him forget or violate the promise that he's made to his mother, which is to stay with Sonny. And she's quite clear that, look, you're not going to be able to stop bad things from happening to him. But what you can do is be there with him when he suffers. And the narrator is so disabled by suffering and so frightened of it that he instead avoids it. So when he tells us at the very beginning of the story what it's like learning about Sonny's arrest, he says, "I couldn't believe it. But what I mean is that I couldn't find any room for it anywhere inside me. I had kept it outside me for a long time. I hadn't wanted to know." And so he's quite clear there that this is a deliberate strategy. I hadn't wanted to know. He says, "I'd had suspicions, but I kept putting them away. I hadn't wanted to know." So that coping mechanism of denial is actually what harms him. It harms Sonny. It keeps him away from Sonny. It makes him break the promise that he made to his mother. So in its own way, it is as damaging to the narrator and to his relationship with Sonny as Sonny's addiction is.
The word listen
Yeah.
or hear is repeated countless times, mostly about not listening and not hearing for at least the first three quarters of the story. At the very end, there is some listening and some hearing. Is there any observations you have about listening?
Well, it seems to me that listening is the opposite of denial. It's the opposite of holding yourself distant from and away from somebody. And again, this made me think of the kinds of things that Saul talks about in his book, in particular, the need to engage with somebody, the need to sort of shut off or shut down judgmentalism so that you can open up curiosity. And listening is about the first step in doing that. And there is this insistence throughout the story that people need to listen. And probably the narrator's biggest shortcoming is his fear of listening, fear of hearing the suffering that Sonny has experienced and that others have experienced and that he himself has experienced. He needs to learn how to listen.
This is where we wonder if it's really a story that speaks to healthcare. Are there ways in which we can compare the narrator to many healthcare practitioners, including doctors today? And do either of you want to comment on that?
Well, I'm struck by a comment that the narrator makes when he's actually at the school with his kids, because he's an algebra teacher, and you could argue, oh, what a noble profession. He's come up out of Harlem, he's gotten an education, and now he's there to be a teacher. What that sounds extremely meaningful, but that's not what he conveys about the experience of being a teacher. Instead, he describes how he and his fellow teachers are kind of burned out and detached from these kids, and he describes how these kids kind of show up with a certain joy in life when they're young, and how that recedes quickly, and how the creativity is kind of something that fades and that they lose, and their fun laughter turns into something that's more that becomes angry. And at one point he says, I stood up and walked over to the window. This is when he's at school, and looked down into the courtyard. It was the beginning of the spring, and the sap was rising in the boys. A teacher passed through them every now and then, quickly, as though he or she couldn't wait to get out of that courtyard, to get those boys out of their sight and off their minds. That's detachment and burnout. And so I think Baldwin is not telling us that this narrator, who, and again, I think it's so interesting that he never tells us his name. He never gives him a name. In fact, Sonny always refers to him just as brother. So there's a clear message to the reader that this person is nameless. He's an algebra teacher. He narrates the story. He's burned out. He has trouble relating to his brother, although he cares a lot about him. And perhaps he's the central figure in this story about suffering. Although it's interesting because Sonny's supposed to be the central figure. But I think one of the things that Laura's saying is maybe Baldwin's telling us that actually, as they say, physician, heal thyself, right? There's that message that we've all heard. And of course, this algebra teacher is not a physician, but I think that those who have read quite a bit of Baldwin know that Baldwin often wrote his stories in such a way so that he would have characters that would be, quote, relatable to white people. So someone like the narrator serves multiple purposes in this story. But I think one of those purposes is to be sort of relatable to, quote, white people, to be a sort of model black man, right, who does all the right things and comes up, but not all as well. I think that's to some degree evocative of what happens to people who become physicians, for instance, who go through a system. And of course, they're at a very different place in the hierarchy. They're far more detached than this narrator is from his brother. The narrator's much closer because he quote unquote loves him. It's his brother. And yet, despite the fact that he's so much closer, it ain't going very well. The relationship between them has many of the dysfunctional elements of a doctor-patient relationship, in the sense that this algebra teacher just keeps not asking questions, making assumptions, wanting Sonny to just get over it and follow a certain path. And that's unfortunately what so many of us do as well. And I think that's where this story starts to have some lessons for us, for those of us who take care of people who are suffering.
What do you think, Laura?
I agree. I mean, I think that immediately after the narrator learns that Sonny has been arrested, he runs into this junkie friend of Sonny's. And the junkie friend of Sonny's says, So what are you going to do? about Sonny. And the narrator's response strikes me as the kind of response that a frustrated doctor might make, which is, I'm not sure I'm going to do anything. Anyway, what the hell can I do? As though it's not his problem. This is somebody behaving badly, making bad choices, showing weak character. What the hell can I do, right? And what's interesting here is that the junkie figure is trying to suggest to the narrator that he has responsibility here. And the narrator tries very hard to push that responsibility away. And in fact, the junkie takes more responsibility. He worries that he's the one who originally told Sonny that heroin feels good. And he was worried, oh, maybe I got him addicted because I told him that. So in this way, the junkie is more connected to Sonny, more willing to feel responsible for him than his own brother is. And then there's another passage where Sonny essentially turns to his brother. This is when the brother's making some progress. He's trying to get better. But the narrator is still trying to sort of force Sonny into this narrow category, this narrow path. And Sonny's talking about suffering and how sometimes heroin makes you feel sure and certain in the way that you read about, Stefan. And so then the narrator comes in and says, there's no way not to suffer, is there, Sonny? Sort of like the authority figure who's like, well, we all have to suffer, And Sonny's response is just amazing. He says, I believe not, he said and smiled. But that's never stopped anyone from trying, has it? I realized with this mocking look that there stood between us forever, beyond the power of time and forgiveness, the fact that I had held silence so long when he had needed human speech to help him. And so this is Sonny just sort of turning it around on his brother, saying, you think I've got an addiction and that's a problem, but everybody tries not to suffer. That we try in different ways. That's what Sonny later says. Nobody just takes it. That's what I'm telling you. Everybody tries not to suffer. You're just hung up on the way some people try. It's not your way. And it seems like that's where things turn around and you realize it's actually Sonny teaching his brother something here. That the narrator's way of coping with suffering is denial and distance. And that contributed to the fact that he kept silence for so long when Sonny needed him, made him break his promise to his mother. And he's trying to say essentially, look, brother, you and I are not very different. You want to think we are, but we're not.
I think this reminds me that we can learn so much from patients, in this case, from patients who are suffering and perhaps suffering from addiction. So when the narrator says, there's nothing I can do, and again, if we make the analogy here, to the physician, I think that, of course, the physician would say, well, we can put him on buprenorphine, right? The physician would have a pharmacologic intervention. That's a given. And that's, of course, important. We know that pharmacologic interventions are incredibly valuable and evidence-based. But we're talking about something else here. We're talking about the relationship between two humans, two people, and the sense of sheer humanity that can exist or not exist or be suppressed or kept at bay between any two people. Now, just as this unnamed algebra teacher keeps holding his brother at a distance, despite so many reasons not to do that, physicians do that as well. And why do they do that? Well, that's the key question. Is it out of fear? Is it because they're uncomfortable with the emotions that it might evoke in them? Is it because they feel hollowed out? Because staring suffering in the face is too frightening for them? There are many reasons, and all of them reflect a sense of something missing, a sense of being less than fully present. And just as about the algebra teacher. And I think Baldwin was concerned with how the hierarchical structure around which this country is built, with its foundations in exploitation and racism, have contributed not just to the suffering of those who have been affected directly by racism, but those who are part of this. And again, this is going to sound kind of political lefty, but part of this sort of capitalist exploitative structure. Medical school And the process of becoming a physician begins with idealism. It begins with people who come in to medical school wanting to change the world, wanting to make a difference, wanting to have relationships. That's why they choose that path as opposed to saying going into the corporate world or becoming engineers. And yet what happens during that process, what changes in them, essentially in a way either hollows them out or forecloses the opportunity for personal growth so that they end up a little bit like an algebra teacher in the sort of sense of this story. Somebody who takes a kind of mechanistic view and who is unable to engage, to care. And what that does is create first of all, it doesn't relieve suffering for the person who needs help, but it also, in some ways, creates a sense of emptiness and ultimately suffering and burnout for high school teachers who are like this narrator, and for the physician who interacts day after day, perhaps with people who have addiction, who are suffering, but won't engage and just pulls out the prescription pad. And I think that's where we start to see a parallel between what seems like an unlikely connection, which is a brother in Harlem who has been through so much, and for the purposes of our conversation, a physician who is far, far better off in the material sense, but who is part of a system that all of us are in, and that Baldwin saw in its totality.
Saul, if I can, I want to acknowledge that when you set up this topic, I read the story with a certain skepticism, as I always do when you set something up. But part of me thought, look, the algebra teacher, who's the narrator in this story, doesn't hate his brother, and he doesn't want his brother to die. He is afraid for his brother. The fear he has on behalf of his brother keeps coming through again and again. There is a lack of connection or a lack of engagement, but it would be hard to say that he merely has no connection to his brother. It's a connection about the fear for his brother's safety. And I do think that's important. That is, it's not a completely alienated situation. And I want to ask, if you're playing out the analogy to medicine and to doctors, could I, as a doctor, say, look, I want my patients to do well, Saul. You're indicting me unfairly. I don't want my patients to die. And am I being like the algebra teacher if I do that?
Yeah, I think that what's telling in this story is that, as I mentioned before, even though the algebra teacher loves his brother and is so much closer than, say, any physician would be with any patient, or almost any physician with almost any patient, we still end up with this failure to engage. And I think that the message, at least for me, is that there's a failure to engage when we sit with a patient who is suffering, who has addiction, and we are not opening ourselves to say, gosh, you seem to be having a really, really difficult time. Tell me about it. What can I do? Sonny's brother never does that. He doesn't do that. And that's what's missing. It's what's missing between the algebra teacher and the student, and it's what's missing between the physician and the patient when there's a failure to engage. And I think that, to me, is where the parallel lies.
And I actually think that fear drives that kind of disengagement.
Absolutely.
It's not that doctors don't care about their patients, but I think especially, I mean, I haven't been through medical school, but I think especially when you go through that experience, you tend to sort of shut down and protect yourself in an attempt to keep yourself safe. And then I think there's a tendency, at least that some of the doctors I've spoken to, of sort of thinking, well, sickness happens to other people. But I mean, Baldwin says that white people can't face the fact that life is tragic and that we die. And he says to be a full human being, instead of being afraid of that reality and trying to hide from it, you have to look it in the face and do something with it. And if you refuse to, you will live this arid life that does not have meaning, and you will die a damaged person.
Another parallel here, which I think is tied to what you were just saying, which is what happens when you have that narrowness of mind. And that is that you start to give people advice based on your narrowness of mind without opening up and listening to them. So for the algebra teacher, it's just like, dude, you just need to get off, just go to school. Doesn't matter whether you love what you do, get your bachelor's degree, and then go just become an accountant, do something. All right. And for the physician, it's like, oh man, you just need to, you gotta get you on some buprenorphine, get you into some kind of like program.
Program.
Yeah, get you into a program. And we said it together. Get you into a program, and you're going to have to exercise some willpower. It's going to be tough, but there's really no other way. So in both cases, and what's interesting is that in some way, the physician who goes through medical training has also been told that. You just got to take all these damn multiple choice exams, right? If you're feeling miserable and burned out, just suck it up. That's what it takes, sleepless nights, memorizing stuff, presenting on rounds, becoming an efficient task completer. That's how you succeed, right? And in both cases, you end up burned out, feeling empty, not fulfilled, somehow feeling like it didn't turn out the way you thought it would. And then what do? You turn around and give people the same advice because that's all you know. And that's what the algebra teacher does. And that's what the physician does. And so it's sort of self-perpetuating. And then you get somebody like Sonny, who's an artist. And Sonny isn't going to have it. Artists are always the troublemakers. Baldwin wrote about there's the troublemakers. They're the ones who just won't go along with it. And they're like, I would rather die than, in fact, I will die if I don't go down this route of finding expression. And they are also our salvation in society. The artist is the troublemaker, the one who upsets the apple cart, who the corporate structure hates more than anything else, but they are the ones who push back. And Sonny's an artist. And I think that's, in some ways, he's the light that shines rather than the problem. And as we start to see towards the end, he begins to shine a light that becomes meaningful and helpful to guide his so-called, has it all together older brother.
Yeah, Lord, you can comment on what's all said, but I certainly want you to begin to take us to that place where Sonny seems to be rescuing his brother.
Yeah. I mean, what's interesting about the story ends by the narrator being willing to come to watch Sonny play in a nightclub somewhere in Harlem. Instead of having his attitude and thinking jazz musicians are weird and disreputable, going and listening to his brother actually play. And when he does, he gets this really interesting and changed view of what it takes to make music. I mean, first of all, he says, all I know about music is that not many people ever really hear it. So there's that notion of listening again, that people aren't really listening. But when he describes the musician, he says, the man who creates the music is hearing something else, is dealing with the roar rising from the void and imposing order on it as it hits the air. So there's this sense that actually the artist is immersing himself in the roar rising from the void, in the terrible storm of suffering and meaninglessness and difficulty, and shaping it into something. And he says they do that at the risk of ruin, destruction, madness, and death. And I think we have to take that very seriously. I mean, I think it's all too easy to say, oh, well, this is a story about addiction, but look, the solution here is we all just have to become musicians or whatever, and we'll figure out ways to be fine then. What I like about what Baldwin does is he doesn't sugarcoat the risk of what Sonny is doing. What Sonny is trying to do is get his brother and everybody around him to confront their own suffering and to do something other than run away from it, to do something useful and creative with it. But to do that means you have to immerse yourself in that suffering. You cannot turn away from it. And that's why when Sonny goes to play with the band in the nightclub, there's this guy, Creole, he's the bass player, and he's the older guy. The narrator says he was having a dialogue with Sonny and that he was listening to everything, but he was listening to Sonny. He was having a dialogue with Sonny. And he says he wanted Sonny to leave the shoreline and strike out for the deep water. He was Sonny's witness that the deep water and drowning were not the same thing. He had been there and he knew, and he wanted Sonny to know. And that's just such a wonderful image where he's sort of saying, come on, Sonny, you have to get out into the deep water. You're not going to make music if you don't swim into that sea of trouble. But you don't have to drown in it. And Creole is the witness. I've been there. I know you can do this differently. And in fact, that's what happens And then what happens to the brother as a result of all this when Sonny finally sort of gets into the deep water and Creole bids him Godspeed. When he does that, what happens to the narrator is this powerful confrontation with his own suffering and with the suffering of the whole history behind him, of his parents and his grandparents. The narrator associates that with freedom, that confronting this suffering gives them freedom. And he says, freedom lurked around us, and I understood at last that he could help us be free if we would listen, and that he would never be free until we did. Yet there was no battle in his face now. I heard what he had gone through, would continue to go through, until he came to rest in earth. He had made it his, that long line of which we knew only Mama and Daddy. And he was giving it back as everything must be given back, so that, passing through death, it can live forever. I saw my mother's face again, and felt for the first time how the stones of the road she had walked on must have bruised her feet. I saw the moonlit road where my father's brother died, and it brought something else back to me and carried me past it. I saw my little girl again, and felt Isabel's tears again, and felt my own tears begin to rise. And yet I was aware that this was only a moment, that the world waited outside hungry as a tiger, and that trouble stretched above us longer than the sky. And so the narrator hears the suffering in Sonny's music, and it connects him to his own suffering. It connects him to this long line of people who have suffered. And it brings him something like freedom. Instead of running away from it, this is the thing he actually needs to run toward. But it is not easy. I mean, he says, he insists, this was a moment, that trouble stretched above us longer than the sky. So that the suffering isn't going to go away just because you've expressed it once in music or in addiction or in whatever. Suffering demands to be felt, and you have to keep engaging with it. And it's hard. I mean, it's hard to do that.
In case we didn't linger on this, the narrator's loss of his daughter to polio played a role in causing him to write to Sonny when Sonny was in prison. And that loss kind of sits there unaddressed until the very end of the story, where the narrator's listening to Sonny play jazz and he suddenly can feel something about the loss of his daughter, which is very powerful. And I think that it's the gift that Sonny gives his brother, is to give him a space to recognize where and how it can hurt inside. And I think it's rather provocative to suggest that when a patient suffers, they're sharing it with us, and we are clinicians. They may, in some ways, also be showing us a moment where we are allowed to recognize our own suffering. This runs contrary to the traditional understanding of what we are supposed to do with healers. I will offer two quotes that go opposite to each other. One is from The House of God, a 1978 novel. The patient is the one with the disease, meaning that there's this line that separates us both. The other is, there was a patient of ours who we took care of for many years in our own clinic, who talked about his relapses regularly and educated us about all the different ways in which he found to make potentially non-drugs into usable, abusable drugs. And I often felt like he had given us a gift by being so frank with us about what he was going through. There is a story online about us where I'm talking with him, and it's pretty bizarre. I'm the doctor, he's the patient, and he's talking about how he's gotten sober, but he doesn't feel right. And I say, at any given moment, any one of us feels unsure about who to be or what to do or how to do it. And I was not just speaking for him, I was speaking for myself. I feel that way. You have extra burdens, but you're not alone, I said. Everyone has times when they don't have clarity. And I truly meant, I also have times when I don't have clarity. And it was a little bit of a gift that that particular patient gave us by sharing so much of it with us. And Sonny sort of does that for his brother.
Yeah, that's exactly what he does, I think.
I think that when Creole reaches out to Sonny and kind of guides him out to sea to find a place where he is sort of in his groove as an artist, because there's this moment where Sonny is struggling to find himself in. He's playing the piano, he's improvising, he's got this group of musicians around him, and they're all waiting for this very gifted young man to begin to express himself as an artist. When Crail sort of guides him and the other musicians sort of hover around him, you have this sense of love. And James Baldwin, if there's one theme throughout all of his work, it is love. And Baldwin had a very elevated notion of love. When he talked about love, it wasn't sort of love in the sense of romantic love. He talked about love as what I might refer to as caring. It's the sense that people can have a sense of shared humanity, that they can set aside their preconceptions about each other, that they can stop hating, that they can stop trying to control, that they can stop exploiting, that all of these things are possible. And when people stop doing all that, what's naturally left is love. Love is not hard in the sense that you have to work for it. It's what you have to remove in order to be left with love. And I think that as physicians, and perhaps as other healthcare professionals, we go through this process, which, well, and to some degree, it begins well before we get to medical school, but we go through this process where we become increasingly detached, and I say task focused. And what is missing is that sense of caring. My book on becoming a healer has the subtitle "From Patient Care to Caring About Your Patients," and I think the patient care part of it is sort of this kind of knee-jerk, "Oh yeah, I do patient care." It's just paying lip service to the word care. Care's in there, but caring about someone is fundamentally human, and I think it's love. If you're fearful of somebody, if you judge them, all of those things are going to get in the way and make it impossible to love or to care about a person. And our narrator is doing all those things for most of the story, but what breaks him out of it, as you said, Stefan, is when his daughter dies, his young daughter. He's ripped apart. And even then, he tries to contain it. But it does lead him to reach out to Sonny initially. But then again, he sort of represses it. But then when he's in the space where Sonny is playing music and is expressing whatever it is that Sonny is trying to say through his art, that's when the narrator is able to begin to grieve and to heal. And I think what you're saying, Stefan, is that physicians can heal as well if they're open to the humanity of the people they care for. And that's such a challenge, not only because of the way we're trained, which is to not do that, but also because we have these issues with boundaries. This fear that, if I open up, then I'll completely fall apart. I won't be professional anymore. And yet that need not be the case. We can remain healthcare professionals. There's absolutely no reason we can't remain healthcare professionals in the full sense of the word, and also love the people we care for in the sense that James Baldwin is using the term. I prefer the term care about them. But I think that is in some ways, I think what Baldwin is trying to tell all of us.
Yeah, that certainly resonates for me. Laura, do you have any final comment that you think is a lesson for our listeners, whether they are healthcare providers or not, about what happens here in James Baldwin's telling?
Well, I think in helping us understand what's going on with Sonny and with the narrator here, I mean, one thing is this repeated emphasis on suffering, and that something like addiction occurs in a context of suffering usually, and that if we don't acquaint ourselves with that, if we're not willing to sort of swim into the deep water with the patient, you may not be able to help them or help them as well as you could. And I would say too that you don't have to be a superb jazz musician to convey that suffering. You can be in an emergency room with a doctor telling them how you suffer if the doctor knows how to ask those questions and will listen to your answers. I was thinking of the subtitle of your other book, Saul, which is Listening for What Matters. Or is that the main title? I forget.
It's Listening for What Matters, Avoiding Contextual Errors in Healthcare. And the concept of context is that everybody comes to the table with a story.
Right.
In the case of Sonny, there's a story. And in the case of every human being, there's a story. And I think that love is when you want to know people's story and you care about their story. I think that's what Baldwin is saying in his message.
And it makes me think too of of Eric Cassell, who wrote The Nature of Suffering and the Goals of Medicine, where he says, I think this is a quotation, that medicine has too narrow a notion of its calling, and too narrow in the sense that it assumes that it that you need to treat only disease and pain, and that suffering is not in your domain. It's not the thing you have to deal with. And it seems like if you want to treat all kinds of difficulty, mental health difficulty, including addiction, you need to be able to confront the suffering of your patients. You need not to be too afraid to do that.
I think a key point here is that this is healing for the physician as well.
Yes.
This is not extra work. It's actually extra work. It's mental energy to hold a human at a distance, to not face their suffering, to just go on autopilot and be task focused. It's draining. And I think that so often physicians are taught, oh, if you connect with your patient, if you open yourself to them, it's going to be unbearable. And I think it's actually the other way around. I think it's unbearable not to. And I think that that's what we see with the narrator, that it is unbearable to keep his young brother at such a distance. And he's only able to begin to heal when he stops doing that. And again, when you get to this whole idea of love, Baldwin isn't saying that, yeah, in addition to prescribing buprenorphine, you have to put all this extra effort in to confronting suffering and trying to love your patients. That's not what he's saying. What he's saying, and again, this is a metaphor, it's in addition to giving them buprenorphine, you need to stop judging them, stop making assumptions about them, stop focusing just on narrow task completion, and open yourself up to the fact that you are with a real person and find out what's going on with them, show them some love, care about them, and that is the best thing you can do for yourself, in addition to being humane and helpful and meaningful and healing for a person who has come to you with their suffering.
Well, thank you so much, Laura and Saul. I only wish that we could interview James Baldwin now to find out if he would agree with everything we said, but I really appreciate your investment, time, and warmth in reflecting on this episode. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
We hope you've enjoyed this latest episode of On Becoming a Healer. If you have and you haven't already subscribed, please consider doing so now. Also, please rate us on the Apple Podcast app, as it will help others find us. And if you have a few moments, leave a review. In addition, if you'd like to make a comment about this episode, we'd love to hear from you. There are a couple ways to do that. If you're using the Apple Podcast app, then just open the episode website link and enter your comment there. Or you can directly go to the website contextualizingcare.org, select the podcast tab, and then scroll down and click on the episode. There you'll find the same comment box. Finally, you can always reach us at onbecomingahealer@gmail.com.